that we were in the midst of a disaster. And it's a disaster that was imminently preventable. We, in 2018, confronted many of these challenges, and we laid out the concerns in the lawsuit that Fair Fight Action filed in 2019. But we have also been working closely with state and local leaders trying to prepare for what we knew would be disastrous if not done properly. The Secretary of State and this administration decided to purchase new machines over the objections of many, intended to roll them out, and to do so without the adequate preparation. We know that in 2002, when Kathy Cox served as Secretary of State, and there was also a purchase of new machines, there were exhaustive steps taken to ensure that every person, every staff person was trained, that there were extra Secretary of State officials on hand across the state of Georgia, that each voter had mailed instructions to help them understand the process. And that was done without the threat of COVID-19. What we know happened this week, this month, in this process is that the best intentions met the worst preparation. And we found ourselves in the midst of both incompetence and malfeasance. And unfortunately, the Secretary of State is now trying to shift the blame, and he's trying to create a pretext that only a few counties are being impacted and that this is a localized problem. But that is untrue. Across the state of Georgia, from Morgan County to Jasper County, from Fulton to DeKalb, but Clayton to Muskogee to Chatham, in every area of our state, we are seeing folks who are being denied the right to vote or being forced to wait in hours-long lines. And the problem is when people are forced to wait in lines that can stretch as long as 5, 6, 7 hours, we don't know who leaves. We don't know who gives up because they cannot afford to stay. We know that the absentee ballot initiative, which was the right thing to do, immediately ran into problems when the out-of-state vendor was selected who could not meet the challenge of the moment. For example, my absentee ballot, when it finally arrived, had an unusable return envelope. And so I had to vote in person today because I could not replace that envelope. We know across the state, thousands of requests for absentee ballots were not returned. And we know that this was a preventable problem if we had done the work, if the Secretary of State and his office had held to their responsibility. Now, you're going to hear the Secretary of State say that under his leadership, turnout increased, but any problems belong to the counties. That is a passing of the buck, and it is a false reading of the Constitution of Georgia. Georgia places the Secretary of State in charge of elections. That means training, that means giving direction, and that means investment. And every time there was a flare sent up that there was a problem facing us in this election, it was the Secretary of State's responsibility to work with the counties to solve those problems, especially when it is the most populous counties in the state. It is not sufficient to say that the county you live in determines the quality of your democracy. That's why we have a secretary of the entire state, not just the counties that do it right, not just the counties that have the resources, not just the counties that he likes, but he's the secretary of the entire state of Georgia's elections process. And so we will continue through Fair Fight Action in cooperation with the Democratic Party of Georgia and other organizations to fight to fix our elections. Because what happened today, what happened last week, what has happened over the last few months cannot be repeated in November. Democracy is too important. And we cannot divorce today's bad behavior and terrible, terrible execution. We cannot divorce it from the protests and the demonstrations that are happening around the country, including here in Georgia. Because voting is not simply about pulling a lever, pushing a button, making a selection. It's about setting the direction of our communities. It's about determining how we are going to respond to the catastrophe of COVID-19, to not only the public health crisis, but the economic crisis that will continue to assail us. It's about paying attention to the issues of police brutality, paying attention to the necessity of fixing the systemic inequities that have given Georgia among the highest rates of COVID-19, particularly for African Americans. It's about how we prepare for the next decade. And those choices can only be made when voters have the right and the ability to vote in the state of Georgia. We are going to watch slow returns come in tonight, and we need to prepare for this on a national level. Because what's happening in Georgia, while it once again is a singular example of the failed leadership of the Republican Party, it is also emblematic of what's going to happen around this country as voter suppression becomes an all-out war. As they watch the returns, as they watch the numbers of people who show up, the multi-ethnic, multi-generational turnout that we've seen here in Georgia, we know that Republican voter suppression is only going to amp up. And we have to be prepared to fight back. Fair Fight is doing that work, as are a number of organizations, but it's going to be incumbent upon every American to demand that no matter which state we're in, that no state should look like Georgia did today. That's what we're calling for, and we hope that we can work with the Secretary of State to correct the errors, to fully and properly resource our counties, and to ensure that every vote can be cast and every vote can be counted in November of 2020. I'm happy to take any questions.
Okay, to ask a question, I will ask you to raise your hand, and the way that you do that is to click participants at the bottom of the screen. When you do that, you will see a participants bar come up to the right, and then there will be a raise hand function. So participants at the bottom of the screen, and then you'll see the window come up to your right, and at the bottom there is a raise hand function. Okay, just 1 minute as we allow hands to raise. And just 1 more second as I see additional hands raised. Okay, our first question is from Kara Court of CBS, but Kara, it looks like you have muted yourself. So if you could unmute yourself. Okay, it now looks like you're unmuted, Kara, and you can go ahead with your question.
Thank you, Seth. Thank you all for doing this. Leader Abrams, I'm just wondering if you can give a little more detail into what you experienced with your voting. Can you explain more what was wrong with your envelope and what going to the polls was like for you today?
Sorry.
Leader, I apologize. If you could start over your answer, you are now unmuted.
Thank you. Thank you, Kara, for the question. I applied for my absentee ballot in May when there was some delay in receiving it, but when it finally arrived, I pulled out the ballot, completed it, and got ready to put it in the return envelope, which was sealed shut. And I attempted to steam it open because I've watched lots of mystery shows. It did not work. And I was unable to open the envelope, which meant that I was unable to return my ballot. I attempted to get a substitute envelope. That was not possible. And so I had to go and vote in person today. Luckily for me, I live in an area where the lines were not terribly long. It was about a 45-minute process. But all I can think about are the people who did not receive their ballots, who were forced instead into hours-long lines, and not because they failed to do their part, but because the Secretary of State's office failed to properly manage this election.
Okay, and just 1 second as I take the next question. Greg Bluestein from the Atlanta Journal-Constitution, your line is unmuted.
Hi, Leader Abrams. Georgia lawmakers are heading back to session in a few days. What is the first thing they should do in order to address these problems today when they return to the session?
Well, there is a bill sitting before the House. It came out of the Senate on the very last night they were in session, SB 463. Unfortunately, that bill actually has some good things in it that can help improve the elections process, but it also includes some deeply problematic language, including a provision that would formally essentially abdicate responsibility from the Secretary of State. What we saw happening today all day with the Secretary of State pointing to the counties as the bad actors, taking credit for the good that was done. What he intends to do with this legislation is to essentially exempt the state from its responsibility to work with the counties to execute elections. And we know that it is the state's responsibility, which is why they're trying to put into law that they do not have that obligation any longer. In addition, the language would also add an ID requirement for absentee ballots. This would make it more onerous. And the way it's worded, it's an option, but it will become the de facto rule, because essentially it says, if you don't give us your ID, we will have a reason to reject your ballot. And in a time of COVID-19, the deep worry is going to be that people are going to think they have to include a copy of their driver's license and their ID in their absentee ballot process. That will stop some people from participating through absentee ballots at all. It's particularly concerning for senior citizens who will be privy to identity theft. But the larger challenge is that it adds another layer to a process that does not suffer from fraud, it suffers from execution. And by making it even more onerous to participate and vote by mail, we're going to see more people in line, we're going to see longer lines, and we're going to see a further collapse of our system. And so the third opportunity that could be in this bill but is not, is creating vote centers in every county. We know that there are going to be what we saw today, which is that precincts, the polling places are going to close, they may move. There is no notification process that is uniform across the state. There is no provision for voting centers, which would essentially operate the same way early voting does today. A few places in each county, particularly in our larger counties, so that people can go and cast their ballots using the same technology that we currently have in place for early voting. We're not asking for a lot of them, but we are asking for a sufficient number so that if something happens at a precinct, that instead of someone having to hunt around to find out where they should vote at the last minute, having waited 5 hours in line, that there is a place they know they can go no matter what to vote in person. Those are some of the things that can be put in place in SB 463, and we're going to be working very hard, hopefully to move the state towards improving elections so that we do not see this play out again on a grander scale in November.
And thank you. And I just wanted to note that Verified Action CEO Lauren Growargo has joined the call. And our next question will be from Annie Grayer from CNN. Annie, your line is now unmuted.
Hi, Leader Abrams. This is Annie Grayer with CNN. Thank you again for taking the time to do this. Some of the reporting that we've gotten today, for example, from Rob Pitts, the chairman of the Fulton County Board of Commissioners, said that some of the issues today were due to staffing shortages, where workers who normally would volunteer at polling locations have declined to do so to volunteer because of the risk of coronavirus. How do you mitigate those risks about having poll workers come and volunteer if they're worried themselves about further putting themselves at a health risk? And do you think that that's even a valid explanation for what's happening?
I think it's important for us to recognize that this isn't one failure. This is a systems failure, which is what we articulated in 2018. It's what we have been warning about, that it's not simply one piece that breaks. It is the entire system that's interdependent, that when something falters, the entire system collapses. And so what we know is that had absentee ballots actually worked the way they should have, thousands of people who got into line over the last few days would not have needed to vote in person. And so one of the reasons we found today to be so terrible is that people had to go and vote in person, even though they attempted to lessen the burden and reduce the number of people who were going to be necessary as staffers. But number two, we knew that this was going to be a challenge. This is not a surprise. And in the state's most populous county, it is incumbent upon the Secretary of State to work with the Fulton County Board of Elections to solve this problem. And that could have meant offering more pay. There are a number of ways to entice more people to show up. In fact, I believe Fulton County asked for emergency support to bring on new poll workers, and they did not receive it. That's the reason we have a state government. It's the reason we have a Secretary of State, because every county can't solve all of its problems alone. We have a state elections system. I think the other piece to recognize is that other states are facing this and they're meeting these challenges. Jocelyn Benson, the Secretary of State of Michigan, has been working since early this year to anticipate the need for more staff workers, because we do know that poll workers tend to be over the age of 60. They are the most vulnerable to COVID-19. And so we knew this was coming. What we are asking of the current Secretary of State of Georgia is that he follow the leaders around this country and work to actually support our counties and not blame them for his failures.
Our next question will come from Sam Levine from The Guardian. Sam, your line is unmuted.
Hi, Leader Abrams. Thank you for doing this call. I'm curious, when you look at what you saw today in Georgia, what you saw in Washington, D.C. and Pennsylvania last week, what we saw in Wisconsin a few months ago, how confident are you that states are prepared to run the kinds of elections that they need to run this year in November? Are we going to see what happened in Georgia today play out times 50 on November 3rd?
There are some states that are better positioned than others, in part because those states have an intention of actually letting every person vote. And when you start with the right intention, I think the process works better. There are states that have new laws that they're trying to implement. And one of the reasons you have the opportunity in a primary to understand what the challenges are so you can prepare for the November election. Part of our deep concern here in Georgia is that the response we're hearing from the Secretary of State is not that he acknowledges the flawed system and the problems that exist. He is blaming others and abdicating any responsibility. And you cannot fix what you don't acknowledge you are responsible for fixing. But the other piece of it is we know that it's going to take federal dollars to shore up our election system. The HEROES Act allocates $3.6 billion because we know that this is going to happen. We know that the incredible enthusiasm that was present in Georgia, and we have seen around this country, that that's going to be amplified dramatically in November. And the HEROES Act tries to anticipate it by saying, we do need to scale our systems. We do need to invest more in making sure we have people who are willing to show up at the polls, if that means paying them more and providing them with more PPE. We do know that we need to increase the efficiency of vote by mail. So let's put those dollars in place, as well as those guardrails, so that people can use that process and we can get them out of line. It is not that we don't know the answer. It is that the Republican Party in particular has been resistant to solving the problem. And that will put our elections in jeopardy. But my belief is that if American citizens demand what we deserve, which is a functional democracy in the 21st century, it can be delivered. And that means we have to spend from now until November pushing hard on Congress, pushing hard on our secretaries of state and our governors to demand the investment and to demand the infrastructure necessary to execute our elections. The HEROES Act lays out the groundwork and puts out the roadmap. Every state has the capacity to meet this challenge if they have the resources, but also if they have the will.
Our next question comes from Richard Elliott of WSB.
Leader Abrams, it may be too early to be able to answer this question. Are y'all looking at any legal action from what you have seen today? And if so, when might that happen?
Yes, and soon. I mean, because we have to remember this, what happened today, we saw a precursor of it on Friday when we had 7-hour lines. What Fair Fight Action has been doing across the state is not only having these conversations trying to prepare for the election, but we've also been gathering stories, gathering declarations, making sure that no one can say they didn't know. And unfortunately in Georgia, sometimes conversation and goodwill don't work. And so litigation becomes the necessary next step.
Okay, our next question is from Archith from Next Star Media Group.
Leader Abrams, thank you so much for your time. A lot of people who were out and about today did leave because of the issues, the weather, and the pandemic. What do you want to tell those voters who perhaps were not able to vote come November on whether they should come back or not, given what they may have faced all over the state of Georgia today?
I think if I'm known for anything, it is for a dogged belief in the value of our democracy and the need to participate despite the obstacles. I would encourage every single Georgian who found themselves forced out of line by the length of time, by the weather, by fears for their lives or for their family, that the only way we get the change we need, the only way we get the leaders we need is by participating in elections. And again, we can't divorce today from what we're seeing happening across this country in response to the murder of George Floyd and Ahmaud Arbery and Breonna Taylor and the litany of names that is too long to be held by memory. And that is that we are attempting to create a society that respects and values every person. And that means respecting the citizens' right to vote in the state of Georgia and around the country. But we won't get that respect. We won't be able to demand that behavior if we do not have the ability to participate in elections that allow us to express our choices, lift our voices, and select people who truly represent us. And so I would say to every one of those voters, please try again. We're in this with you. You know, we delivered signs to tell you where to call, water to help keep you hydrated, and we're going to do everything in our power to help deliver a system that lets you participate and vote your choice.
Thank you.
Our next question comes from Priscilla Thompson from NBC News. Priscilla, you are unmuted.
Hi, Leader Abrams. Thank you for taking the time to chat. So you sort of outlined here how the ways in which this was preventable and steps that could have been taken. And I think right now in this country, there's an overarching conversation happening around accountability. And so I'm curious, what does accountability look like to you in this situation? Does it look like a resignation from someone? What does that look like for you?
I I believe first and foremost, we need to fix the problem. There is no political will that I hear right now from the Secretary of State to take ownership and responsibility for this. And until he does, we will not have a solution. I contrast him with Secretary of State Kathy Cox, the only person in modern Georgia who has gone through the same challenge, which is unrolling and unspooling a brand new voting process at a time when people were suspicious of the process. This was done in 2002 in the wake of the 2000 election. And what she did, what her office did, was recognize that they had the ultimate responsibility for training county staff, for providing them with resources, for overperforming in terms of their oversight obligations. In fact, they had something that they called night lights, so they could track and make sure that the electricity was working. They did everything in their power to situate the counties for success. Accountability in this moment means that we have a Secretary of State who takes his job seriously and doesn't just take credit for the things that go well, but takes responsibility when things do not, and is willing to ask for the resources, in fact, demand the resources necessary and take the steps necessary to ensure that no matter where you live in the state of Georgia, your access to democracy is not undermined. And until he's willing to do that, he is not being accountable. And that is what I demand. I think resignation, it sounds nice, but what we need is action. We need someone who actually does his job. And that's what I want to hold Secretary of State Raffensperger to.
Okay, and our last question will come from Laura Barron from Politico. If you did not get a chance to ask your question on this Zoom, please do send me an email if you like at seth@fairfightaction.com. I'll be happy to get back to you. Laura, your line is unmuted.
Thank you. Leader Abrams, earlier in the day, the Secretary of State's office released a statement chalking up a lot of the problems to, quote, human error. And I was wondering if you could talk about what testimonials or reports Fair Fight got in terms of the actual voting machines and what breakdowns happened electronically.
I mean, we know anecdotally that there were counties across the state, and let's be clear, this is not simply endemic to Fulton, DeKalb, Cobb, and Gwinnett, our four most populous counties. This happened across the state. It happened in Coffee County. It happened in Jasper County. The problem was inoperable machines, poor training on those machines, training that the Secretary of State is responsible for providing because he is the person who selected those machines and decided this was the way every county was going to run their elections. We know that the poll pads that you had to use to check in, that those weren't working in certain places. We know that some communities didn't get an adequate number of machines, which, going back to Greg's question earlier, is another thing that's going to have to be dealt with. Yes, there's going to have to be social distancing, but an inadequate amount of equipment is not acceptable. And so we know that human error the human error that we need to look to is the error by the Secretary of State in refusing to meet this moment by doing his job properly and by trying to shift responsibility onto others so that he doesn't have to take responsibility and be held accountable for his inaction and his poor planning and his horrific execution.
With that, we will conclude this virtual press avail. I thank you all for joining and bringing attention to the issues facing voters across the state of Georgia and across the country. Thank you, Leader Abrams, and everyone, please have a safe and happy evening.
Thank you all. Good night.